Everyone ignored the sick stray cat lying dying next to the garbage dump. The deaf woman's actions surprised everyone. What if the key tattoo on Sonny's ear wasn't just a veterinarian's mark, but a clue to a much larger forgotten network of kindness? David Vance had started a network that held a shocking secret about the town's own hidden history. The deaf woman's actions didn't just save a cat. They began to unravel a thread that could change everything. Like, subscribe, and listen to uncover the true legacy unlocked by the unseen kindness. The alley was a typical urban scar squeezed between a laundromat whose dryers perpetually rumbled and a boarded-up storefront promising future development. For the past 5 years, the orange cat lay amidst a scattering of sodden cardboard and overflowing plastic bags, a splash of fading color in a world of gray and grime. Its eyes were slits dull with pain and exhaustion. A faint rattling wheeze escaped its chest with every labored breath. It didn't even have the strength to lift its head as the old woman approached. Mrs. Elara Vance moved with a quiet grace that belied her 70-odd years. She wore a simple, clean coat, slightly threadbare at the cuffs, and carried a worn canvas tote bag. As she reached the cat, she knelt her knees, protesting with a soft crackle that went unheard by her. Her face etched with the fine lines of a life lived with keen observation, softened with an expression of profound sorrow. The delivery driver, a young man named Marco, paused a box of detergent halfway to his shoulder. He'd seen the cat earlier, felt a pang, but his schedule was tight. Now he watched intrigued. The teenager, Leo, slouched against the brick wall, phone momentarily forgotten. Also observed this unusual tableau. Old people usually avoided this alley. Elara reached out a gentle hand, not to touch the cat immediately, but to let her presence be known. The cat flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. Elara's hand remained steady. She then rummaged in her tote bag and pulled out a soft, faded wool scarf, its pattern a muted plaid. Carefully, almost reverently, she began to wrap it around the small, shivering body, her movements economical and tender. She didn't speak. She didn't coo or make soothing noises. Her communication was entirely in her touch, in the gentle pressure of her hands, in the unwavering kindness in her eyes. Once the cat was cocooned in the scarf, she scooped it up, cradling the fragile weight against her chest. The cat, perhaps sensing a flicker of warmth and safety, for the first time in days, or perhaps too weak to resist, remained limp in her embrace. Elara rose her gaze, sweeping briefly over Marco and Leo, a neutral, unreadable expression. Then, with the dying cat held securely, she turned and walked out of the alley, her steps as deliberate as when she had entered. She didn't look back. Marco lowered his box, a frown creasing his brow. "Well, I'll be," he muttered to himself. Leo pushed himself off the wall, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Who was she? And why, when everyone else had walked by, had this quiet, deaf old woman stopped for a creature that seemed beyond saving? The alley seemed emptier. Now the grime more pronounced, the silence heavier, punctuated only by the distant rumble of Franklin Avenue and the unanswered questions hanging in the damp air. Part 2. Context and Inciting Incident. 800 words. Elara Vance had lived in the same small second-floor apartment overlooking Franklin Avenue for over 40 years. Her world was one of textures, vibrations, and the rich tapestry of visual information that most hearing people took for granted. She had been profoundly deaf since a bout of scarlet fever in early childhood, and her life had been shaped by this silence, but not defined by it in the way others might assume. She was a keen observer, her eyes missing little, her understanding of human nature often more astute than those who relied on spoken words. Her husband David, a veterinarian with a heart as big as his laugh, a laugh Elara had felt as a warm rumble in his chest, had been her bridge to the hearing world, his hands always ready to sign his patients endless. He had passed away 10 years ago, leaving a silence in her life that was far deeper than the absence of sound. Since then, Elara had lived a quiet, self-contained existence. Her days were structured by routine, her morning walk, weather permitting her visits to the library. She was a voracious reader, her meticulous tending of the small collection of houseplants that thrived under her care on her windowsill. The neighborhood around Franklin Avenue was a mix of long-time residents like Elara newer immigrant families and a transient population of students and young professionals. It was a place of casual anonymity where people mostly kept to themselves. A sick stray cat by a dumpster was an unfortunate but unremarkable sight, easily dismissed in the daily rush. Elara had seen the orange cat earlier that morning on her way to the bakery. It had been a fleeting glimpse, but the image of its matted fur and labored breathing had stayed with her, a small sharp stone in her shoe. All through her errands, the image persisted. It wasn't a conscious decision that led her back to the alley, but rather an undeniable pull. A quiet insistence from a place deep within her that understood suffering, that valued life in all its forms, however fragile. This was the true inciting incident, not just seeing the cat, but the internal unwavering compulsion to return to act. Back in her small clean apartment, the scent of old books and Earl Grey tea, a comforting familiarity. Elara gently placed the bundled cat on a soft towel on her kitchen floor. The journey from the alley had been slow. Elara careful not to jostle her precious cargo. The cat, she decided to call him Sonny, a small prayer for the brightness she hoped to bring back to his fading life, was still terrifyingly still. Her deafness in some ways made this initial care more focused. She couldn't be distracted by pitiful meows or frightened hisses. Instead, she relied on her sight, her touch. She saw the rapid, shallow pulse in his thin neck, the way his eyelids fluttered weakly. She felt the chill of his body, the sharpness of his bones beneath the matted fur. With practiced hands, she prepared a shallow bowl of warm water, testing it carefully against her wrist. She found an old eyedropper David had used for orphaned kittens and managed to get a few drops of water between Sonny's lips. His tongue, rough and dry, flickered almost imperceptibly. She cleaned the grime from his face with a damp cotton ball, her touch feather-light. There were no illusions. Sonny was desperately ill. Elara knew with a certainty that settled heavily in her chest that he might not survive the night. But she would not let him die alone in the cold and filth of the alley. Here, in the quiet warmth of her small apartment, he would know kindness, however brief his remaining time might be. Her goal was simple yet profound, to offer comfort, to affirm life even in the shadow of death. She sat beside him, a silent vigil, her hand resting gently on his small, frail body, willing her own warmth, her own quiet strength into him. Part 3. Rising, Action, and Complications. 1,400 words. The first night was touch and go. Ilara barely slept, rising every hour to check on Sonny, to offer a few more drops of water, to adjust the old hot water bottle she'd wrapped in a towel and placed near him. By morning, a faint change. Sonny's breathing seemed a fraction less labored. His eyes, when they flickered open, held a spark more of awareness than of dull resignation. It was a small victory, but it fueled Ilara's quiet determination. Over the next few days, Ilara devoted herself to Sonny's care. She coaxed him to take a little watered-down kitten formula she'd bought from the pet store, then tiny morsels of boiled chicken. She cleaned him gently, his matted fur slowly giving way to reveal the true state of his emaciation. He was little more than skin and bone, but there was a resilience in his small body, a flicker of a will to live that mirrored Ilara's own steadfast hope. As Sonny slowly regained a sliver of strength, Ilara began to notice more details. He was an unneutered male, probably young, no more than a year or two old. His paws were raw, his ears torn in several places, testament to a hard life on the streets. It was while gently cleaning one of those tattered ears that she saw it, a tiny faded tattoo, almost invisible against his pale orange skin. It was a stylized image of an old-fashioned skeleton key. Ilara's heart seemed to stop, then thudded painfully against her ribs. Her breath caught in her throat. She brought Sonny closer to the window, her fingers trembling as she gently stretched the skin of his ear. There was no mistaking it. A key, David's key. Her husband, David, had been more than just a veterinarian. He'd been a dreamer. His most cherished project, one he'd poured his heart and much of their modest savings into, was an attempt to establish a no-kill sanctuary. On a small piece of land they'd inherited an hour outside the city. He'd envisioned it as a true haven for abandoned and abused animals. He'd spent weekends clearing brush, repairing derelict outbuildings, often with Ilara by his side, sharing his vision through animated signs and sketches. He had a system for the animals he rescued personally, especially those he treated for free from dire situations before trying to find them homes. A small, discreet tattoo of a key on the inside of an ear, a key to a new life. Ilara, he'd signed to her, his eyes shining, a key to safety. The sanctuary had never fully materialized. David had died suddenly from a heart attack before his dream could be fully realized. The land had been sold to cover debts. The few animals he'd been caring for, they're dispersed to other shelters, or Ilara had hoped adopted. She had thought that chapter of her life, that part of David's legacy, was closed, a bittersweet memory. And now, this Sonny, a key bearer. He wasn't just a random stray she'd rescued from an alley. He was a link, a tangible breathing connection to David, to his compassion, to his unfinished work. The realization sent a jolt of renewed purpose through Ilara. Saving Sonny was no longer just an act of kindness. It was a mission, a way to honor David's memory. But the complications were immense. Sonny, despite the small improvements, was still profoundly unwell. He had a persistent cough, a worrying lethargy that would descend after brief periods of alertness. Ilara knew with a sinking feeling that he needed more than just her loving care. He needed a veterinarian, and veterinarians cost money. Money she, living on a small widow's pension, simply didn't have. She counted the meager savings in her biscuit tin, enough for her own modest needs for a few months, but certainly not enough for extensive veterinary treatment. The dilemma weighed heavily on her. How could she let David's key bearer die now after he'd miraculously found his way to her? The neighborhood, meanwhile, had taken notice in its own detached way. Marco, the delivery driver, had mentioned the deaf lady and the dying cat. To a few people at the laundromat, Leo the teenager had seen Ilara taking Sonny out for a few minutes of fresh air in a makeshift sling in the small patch of grass behind her apartment building. Whispers followed Ilara on her errands. Some were tinged with admiration, others with a kind of pitying skepticism. She can't possibly save that thing. What's a deaf old woman going to do with a sick cat? The unspoken judgment, even if she couldn't hear the words, was palpable in their averted gazes, their tight-lipped smiles. Ilara, accustomed to her quiet solitude, felt the unfamiliar weight of scrutiny. The stakes were rising, not just for Sonny's life, but for Ilara's own emotional and financial resources, and for the memory of a dream she thought had died with her husband. Sonny's cough worsened, a rattling, wheezing sound that Ilara could feel through the floorboards. When he was particularly distressed, his brief spurts of energy became shorter. His appetite waned. Ilara knew she couldn't wait any longer. The contents of the biscuit tin, her carefully hoarded emergency fund, would have to be sacrificed. It was a terrifying prospect, leaving her with no safety net. But the thought of Sonny, of David's key, was a more powerful imperative. She found an old pet carrier of David's in the back of a closet, dusted it off, and lined it with a soft towel. Getting Sonny inside was surprisingly easy. He seemed to trust her implicitly, his small orange body pliant in her hands. The nearest veterinary clinic was a dozen blocks away, a daunting journey for Ilara, who rarely ventured so far on foot, especially carrying a burden. A bus ride was out of the question with a sick animal. The clinic, Paws and Claws, was bright and modern, a stark contrast to the dimly lit, cluttered practice David had run. A young woman with kind eyes and a name tag reading Dr. Ramirez greeted her. Ilara, through a series of written notes and gestures, explained Sonny's condition, her discovery of him in the alley, her attempts to nurse him back to health. She didn't mention the key tattoo, not yet. She felt a strange protectiveness about it, a secret shared only with David. Dr. Ramirez was patient and thorough. She examined Sonny gently, her expression growing more concerned as she listened to his chest with her stethoscope. "He's a very sick little guy, Mrs. Vance," she said, speaking slowly and clearly, though Ilara relied mostly on lip reading and the doctor's expressive face. "His lungs sound congested. He's severely malnourished and dehydrated. We'll need to run some tests to know exactly what we're dealing with." The tests confirmed Ilara's fears, and then some. Sonny had a severe case of pneumonia, complicated by feline immunodeficiency virus, FIV, a condition that compromised his immune system, making him susceptible to all sorts of infections. The prognosis was guarded. The treatment would be intensive, antibiotics, fluids, supportive care, possibly even oxygen. And it would be expensive. Dr. Ramirez laid out the estimate, her expression sympathetic. It was more than double what Ilara had in her biscuit tin. Ilara's heart sank. She looked at the estimate, then at Sonny, now lying on the examination table, looking even smaller and more fragile in the bright clinic light. Despair threatened to overwhelm her. She had come this far, poured so much of herself into him, only to be faced with an insurmountable financial wall. It was then, as Dr. Ramirez was gently explaining the different, less expensive and less effective palliative care options that Alara made her decision. This was David's legacy. She couldn't give up. She reached into her tote bag, pulled out a small notepad and pen, and wrote, "My husband, David Vance, was a vet. He had a dream for animals like Sonny." Then she carefully took Sonny's ear and showed Dr. Ramirez the tiny faded key tattoo. He marked them his special rescues. Dr. Ramirez leaned closer, her brow furrowed in concentration as she examined the tattoo. A flicker of recognition, then surprise crossed her face. "David Vance," she said slowly. "Hi, I think I've heard that name. My mentor, Dr. Peterson. He sometimes spoke of an older vet, a bit of a maverick who was trying to start a sanctuary years ago. Someone who did a lot of pro bono work for the strays. Was that your husband?" Alara nodded, tears welling in her eyes. She wrote, "Yes, he died before he could finish." A long silence filled the examination room. Dr. Ramirez looked from the tattoo to Alara's earnest, tear-streaked face, then back to the frail kitten. The clinical detachment in her eyes was replaced by a softer, more thoughtful expression. This wasn't just another sick stray. This was a story, a legacy, a connection to the history of their shared profession. "Mrs. Vance," Dr. Ramirez said, her voice imbued with a new warmth, "FIV is serious, and the pneumonia is critical. There are no guarantees, but David Vance's work, his ideals, they matter. Let me talk to my clinic partner. Let me see what we can do. We can't perform miracles, but perhaps we can make the financial side of this a little less impossible." This was the turning point. Alara had stepped out of her silent, solitary world, risked vulnerability, and shared David's story. And in doing so, she had found an unexpected ally. She was no longer just passively caring for Sonny. She was actively fighting for him, for David's dream. Dr. Ramirez's offer, however tentative, was a lifeline. The news of the deaf woman, the dying cat, with the mysterious key tattoo and its connection to a respected, if somewhat forgotten local veterinarian, began to ripple outwards from the small clinic. Alara had reached her point of no return. Sonny's fate was now intertwined with a past she thought was buried and a community she had never truly engaged with. Part 5, build up to climax. 1,300 words. Dr. Ramirez was true to her word. She and her partner, Dr. Chen, reviewed Sonny's case. They were moved by Alara's quiet devotion and intrigued by the story of David Vance and his key tattoo, a piece of local veterinary lore they'd only vaguely heard about. While their clinic was a business, not a charity, they agreed to significantly reduce their fees for Sonny's treatment, classifying much of it under professional courtesy, and training for their junior staff who could learn from the complexities of Sonny's case. They also reached out to a few pharmaceutical reps they knew, securing some of the expensive antibiotics as samples. Sonny was admitted to the clinic for intensive care. Alara visited him every day. The journey was still arduous, but she made it without fail, her canvas tote now carrying a small thermos of homemade chicken broth for Sonny when he was allowed it, and a book to read during her vigil. She would sit quietly by his cage, sometimes just watching him, sometimes talking to him in her own way, her hands making small, comforting gestures, her lips forming silent words. The clinic staff, initially curious about the quiet, deaf old woman, grew to admire her steadfastness. They learned to communicate with her through gestures, notes, and by speaking clearly and directly. Marco, the delivery driver, saw Elara on one of her treks to the clinic, her face etched with worry, but also a fierce determination. He'd heard snippets of the story from a vet tech who frequented the laundromat. He found himself unexpectedly moved. The next day, he happened to be making a delivery near Elara's apartment around the time she usually left for the clinic. "Need a lift, ma'am?" he offered, gesturing towards his van, going right past paws and claws. Elara, surprised and grateful, accepted. It became a quiet, unspoken routine. Marco never asked for anything in return. He just drove a silent, supportive presence. Leo, the teenager from the alley, also found his cynicism pricked. He'd seen Elara with the cat carrier. He'd even seen a small handwritten notice Dr. Ramirez had reluctantly allowed Elara to put up in the clinic waiting room, a simple plea for donations towards Sonny's recovery fund, with a picture of the orange cat and a brief mention of David Vance's key. Leo, an aspiring graphic designer, thought the notice was a bit plain. Without saying anything to anyone, he designed a more eye-catching flyer on his computer, incorporating a stylized key image. He printed a few copies at the library and anonymously slipped them onto community notice boards and under the door of the clinic one evening. The response was slow at first, but it grew a few dollars here and there in the donation jar at the clinic, an extra bag of premium cat food left on Elara's doorstep. Someone from David Vance's old graduating class, now a retired vet himself, heard the story through the grapevine and sent a generous check to the clinic for Sonny's care, but Sonny's battle was far from over. The FIV made him incredibly vulnerable. Just as the pneumonia seemed to be receding, he developed a secondary infection. His small body, already weakened, struggled to fight back. There were days when Dr. Ramirez had to give Elara grim news days, when Elara sat by Sonny's cage, her heart heavy with the fear that she would lose him, that David's key would unlock nothing but more sorrow. These were her darkest moments, where the weight of her decision, the depletion of her savings, the sheer emotional toll felt overwhelming. She would return to her empty apartment, the silence pressing in, and wonder if she was doing the right thing, if she was just prolonging his suffering. Yet every morning, she would rise, her resolve rekindled. She would look at the small framed photo of David on her nightstand, his eyes crinkling at the corners as if sharing a gentle joke, and she would find the strength to continue. Sonny, too, seemed to draw strength from her presence. On his better days, he would weakly push his head into her hand, a tiny rumbling purr vibrating through his frail body. The local community paper, a small weekly publication, got wind of the story. The Key Cat and the Kindly Widow. The journalist, a young woman named Chloe, was touched by the narrative of quiet heroism, a husband's lost dream, and a community's nascent compassion. Her article, sensitively written, brought more attention. The donation jar filled a little faster. People started recognizing Elara on the street, offering smiles of encouragement, sometimes even pressing a few dollars into her hand. The final, most critical stage of Sonny's treatment approached, a delicate procedure to drain fluid that had accumulated around his lungs, a risky intervention for such a compromised animal. Dr. Ramirez and Dr. Chen were cautiously optimistic, but the stakes were incredibly high. Sonny's life, Elara's emotional investment, David's legacy, and the quiet hopes of a small but growing circle of supporters all hung in the balance. Elara prepared herself, her heart a mixture of trepidation and a fragile, tenacious hope. The day of Sonny's procedure was gray and overcast, mirroring the anxiety that settled over the small group gathered in the waiting room of Paws and Claws. Elara was there, of course, sitting ramrod straight on the edge of a vinyl chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Marco had driven her and now sat a few chairs away, flipping through a magazine with unseeing eyes. Leo, surprisingly, had also shown up, hovering awkwardly near the doorway, his usual slouch replaced by a nervous tension. A few other regulars from the neighborhood, people whose hearts had been touched by Chloe's article or Leo's flyers, had quietly come to offer silent support. Dr. Ramirez emerged from the surgical suite after what felt like an eternity. Her scrubs were on her mask, untied and hanging around her neck. Her expression was tired but calm. She walked directly to Elara. All eyes in the waiting room fixed on them, Dr. Ramirez knelt beside Elara, taking her hands. She spoke slowly, her gaze direct and kind. Elara watched her lips intently, her own face pale but composed. "Elara," Dr. Ramirez began, her voice soft but clear enough for those nearby to hear. "The procedure was challenging. Sonny is very weak, as you know. There were a few moments when we were worried." Elara's grip on the doctor's hands tightened almost imperceptibly. The air in the waiting room was thick with unspoken prayers. "But," Dr. Ramirez continued, a small, weary smile finally gracing her lips, "he's a fighter. That little orange spirit of his is incredible. The fluid has been drained. He's stable. He's resting now in recovery." She paused, letting the words sink in. "He made it. Elara, Sonny made it through." A collective sigh of relief rippled through the waiting room. Marco let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Leo leaned against the doorframe, a shaky grin spreading across his face. Elara closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them, tears were streaming silently down her cheeks. But her expression was one of profound, luminous joy. She couldn't hear the quiet murmurs of congratulations or the soft applause that broke out, but she could feel the shift in the room, the warmth, the shared relief. She reached out and squeezed Dr. Ramirez's hands tightly, her silent gratitude more eloquent than any words. Later, when Sonny was settled back in a warm recovery cage, Elara was allowed to see him. He was still groggy, a tiny bandage on his side, but his breathing was noticeably easier, the rattling wheeze gone. He opened his eyes, recognized her, and managed the faintest, weakest purr. Elara gently stroked his head, her touch a benediction. David's key hadn't just unlocked a new life for Sonny, it had unlocked a floodgate of compassion and connection that had touched them all. The central question, whether this frail creature, a symbol of a lost dream, could survive against such odds, had been answered with a resounding purring. Yes, Sonny's recovery was slow but steady. After a few more days at the clinic, he was finally well enough to go home with Elara. Her small apartment, once a haven of quiet solitude, now echoed with the soft patting of paws, the occasional happy chirp, and the contented rumble of Sonny's purrs, which Elara could feel when he curled up on her lap. He was still FIV positive and always would be, requiring ongoing care and a protected indoor life. But he was alive, thriving, a vibrant splash of orange against the muted tones of Elara's quiet world. The change in Elara was just as remarkable. The experience had drawn her out of her shell. Neighbors, who had once been anonymous faces, now greeted her by name, asking after Sonny, often pressing small gifts of cat treats or toys into her hands. Marco continued his informal taxi service for vet checkups. Their drives filled with comfortable silence and shared smiles, Leo, emboldened by the success of his flyers, designed a "Welcome Home Sonny" banner that he and a few other neighborhood kids hung outside Ilara's apartment building. He even started helping Ilara with her groceries, communicating through gestures and a notepad. The Sonny's Recovery Fund had covered most of the discounted vet bills thanks to the community's generosity. The remaining funds, with Ilara's blessing, were used by Dr. Ramirez and Dr. Chen to start a small David Vance Memorial Fund at their clinic dedicated to helping other animals in dire need, especially those rescued by Good Samaritans. David's dream of a sanctuary hadn't died. It had simply found a new, unexpected way to bloom. Nurtured by his widow's quiet courage and the kindness of strangers, Ilara found herself less alone than she had been in years. Her days were still filled with her familiar routines, but now they were punctuated by Sonny's playful antics, by friendly chats, however brief, and gestured with her neighbors, by a sense of belonging she hadn't realized she'd been missing. The silence of her apartment was no longer tinged with loneliness, but with a peaceful contentment. She often thought of David, of his key tattoo. It had been a symbol of hope, of a new beginning. And for Sonny and for Ilara herself, it had been exactly that. The sick stray cat everyone had ignored had, through the unexpected actions of a deaf woman, become a small purring miracle, a testament to the enduring power of compassion and the extraordinary connections that can blossom in the most ordinary of places. Ilara Vance, the quiet woman who lived in a world of silence, had shown everyone the profound language of the heart. Could a simple act of kindness towards a forgotten creature truly ripple outwards to change not only a life, but an entire community's perception? The faded tattoo on a dying cat's ear held a secret, but the truly shocking twist was how one deaf woman's quiet courage could unlock a legacy of love and inspire a wave of unforeseen compassion. Like, subscribe, and listen to the full story of how the unseen became seen and the ignored became cherished.